The year was 1380, and the air was thick with the stench of blood and the clanging of steel. In the heart of Italy, the city of Marino was under siege. Alberigo da Barbiano, a condottiere with a reputation for cunning and ruthlessness, led his army against Bertrand de La Salle, a powerful Gascon mercenary. The battle was fierce, and the ground was soon littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers. But it was Alberigo who emerged victorious, his name ringing through the ranks as the new star of Italian warfare. This victory marked a turning point. The days of large mercenary companies were coming to an end, and the era of the individual captain was beginning. But the story of how this transformation took place is one of power, politics, and the relentless march of war. In the 14th century, war was a costly business. States and city-states spent a fortune on mercenaries, sometimes as much as 60% of their revenue. This led to higher taxes and the need for better financial and administrative systems. The more organized and powerful states like Milan began to see the benefits of having a permanent, well-trained military force. Gingellazzo Visconti, the ruler of Milan, was a master of this new approach. He understood that to achieve his goal of making Milan the dominant power in northern Italy, he needed a strong, loyal army. He appointed Giacopo dal Verme, a Veronese noble, as his captain general. Giacopo, a serious and cautious professional, quickly proved his worth by winning brilliant victories against the French and the Germans. His loyalty to Gingellazzo was rewarded with estates, castles, and even a palace in Venice. But Gingellazzo was not content with just one great captain. He also brought Alberigo da Barbiano into his fold. Alberigo, a seasoned warrior who had fought in Naples and Calabria, was captured in 1392 and ransomed for 30,000 florin. In return, he swore to serve Gingellazzo for 10 years. Together, Giacopo and Alberigo led the Milanese army to new heights, defeating the Florentines at Casalchio in 1402 and capturing Bologna. Florence, the only state that could challenge Milan, relied heavily on the services of John Hawkwood, an English mercenary known for his tactical genius. Hawkwood's most famous victory was at Castignaro in 1387, where he used a feigned retreat to draw the Veronese into a trap. His dismounted cavalry and English archers decimated the enemy, and his reputation as the leading captain in Italy was solidified. Florence lavished him with rewards, including castles, a house in the city, and a life pension. Even after his death in 1394, the Florentines honored him with a grand memorial in the cathedral. But Hawkwood's death left a void, and Florence struggled to find a suitable replacement. They eventually settled on Bernardin de Serres, a Gascon mercenary, but he was defeated by the Milanese at Casalchio in 1402 and soon retired to France. In the chaotic regions of central and southern Italy, the Condottieri played a different role. They were often the arbiters of power, changing allegiances frequently in search of greater personal gain. Boldrino da Panicale, an Umbrian mercenary, and Biordo de Michelotti, a Perugian noble, were among the most notorious. Biordo, in particular, used his military skills to seize control of Perugia and establish himself as its lord. However, his ambitions came to an abrupt end when he was murdered in 1398. As the 14th century drew to a close, the landscape of Italian warfare was changing. The great mercenary companies were giving way to powerful individual captains, and the states were becoming more organized and centralized. The story of these men and the forces that shaped them is one of ambition, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of power. The late 14th and early 15th centuries in Italy were filled with tales of daring and skill, particularly among the Condottieri, the mercenary leaders who shaped the military landscape. One of the most intriguing figures from this time was Sacchino Broglia da Chieri. Broglia was from Piedmont and started his career under the famous condottiero Alberigo da Barbiano. He fought in several significant battles, including Marino and Castignaro, where he served under other renowned leaders like John Hawkwood and Giacopo dal Verme. What made Broglia unique was his reputation as a military instructor. Many of the leading condottieri of the next two generations, such as Facino Cane, Ottobuono Terzo, Carmagnola, Gaetamlata, and Tartaglia, had at some point served in his company. This mentorship earned him great respect, even though he never settled down to rule any particular city. Broglia's career was marked by his travels through central Italy, where he led his company in various conflicts. Despite offers from Florence, including a life pension in 1396, he remained too restless to accept a permanent position. It was only in 1398 that he agreed to become a permanent condottiero for Florence, receiving a house and a pension. Unfortunately, his life was cut short by the plague in 1400, and he was buried with full military honors in Florence's cathedral. The political landscape of Italy changed dramatically around the turn of the century. The death of Gingilazzo Visconti in 1402, after a significant victory over the Florentines at Casalchio, threw the Milanese state into chaos. Gingilazzo's legitimate sons were young and inexperienced, and his will divided the state among them and his illegitimate son, Gabriele Maria. This uncertainty led to revolts in Milan and its subject cities. The Condottieri, who had long been key players in Italian politics, now found themselves in a position to take advantage of the confusion. Some Condottieri, like Alberigo da Barbiano, broke away from the Visconti but were no longer a significant force. Others, such as Pandolfo Malatesta, Ottabuono Terzo, and Gabrino Fingiulo, seized control of cities like Brescia, Parma, and Cremona, setting up their own rule. However, their lordships were short-lived and often ended violently. On the other hand, Giacopo dal Verme, Carlo Malatesta, and Facino Cane remained loyal to the Visconti, though for different reasons. Giacopo dal Verme continued to lead the Milanese army, but the atmosphere of suspicion and self-interest in Milan disillusioned him, and he eventually left to serve the Venetians. Carlo Malatesta, the Lord of Rimini, was only partially committed to the Visconti and intervened sporadically. Facino Cane, however, became the real power in Milan. With the support of Filippo Maria Visconti, the younger of the two brothers, Cane established a base in Alessandria and began to influence the Duke. After the death of the Duchess Caterina, Cane's control over the Duke was complete. However, his ambitions and those of the Duke's older brother, Giovanni Maria, led to his death from gout in 1411. Giovanni Maria's rule was short and marked by his cruel and erratic behavior. He was eventually murdered, and his younger brother, Filippo Maria, took over. Filippo Maria, like his father, was ambitious but not a military leader. He relied on a faithful and permanent army, initially led by Francesco Busson, Count of Carmagnola. Together, they worked to restore the Visconti state, culminating in the expulsion of Pandolfo Malatesta from Brescia in 1421. During this time, Florence, free from the threat of Milanese aggression, focused on civic humanism and the idea of citizens actively participating in both government and defense. This led to a reluctance to spend money on mercenaries, despite military demands such as the attack on Pisa in 1405 to 1406, and the defense against King Ladislas of Naples from 1409 to 1414. Venice, on the other hand, took a different path. In 1404 to 1405, Venice captured Vicenza, Verona, and Padua, expanding its territory and creating a land frontier with Milan. The need for a permanent defense on land led to the creation of a significant army. Carlo Malatesta and Pandolfo Malatesta, two notable condottieri, played key roles in Venice's military campaign. Carlo, the Lord of Rimini, was a well-educated and religious man who had a significant cultural impact. Despite his prestige, he suffered several defeats, including one at the hands of Braccio da Montone in 1416. Pandolfo Malatesta, the younger brother, also had a humanist education and was known for his court in Brescia. After being driven out of Brescia, he served as a Venetian and Florentine commander, maintaining a company that almost resembled a standing army. Another significant figure was Filippo Scolari, known as Pippo Spano. Though he served the Hungarian king, his military skills and cultural influence were notable. Pippo, a Florentine noble, gained military experience fighting the Turks and developed a reputation for ruthless tactics. His cruelty and speed in battle initially surprised the Venetians, but they eventually gained the upper hand. Pippo's connection to Florence, including his support for artists like Masolino and his patronage of architecture, made him a complex and interesting figure. In central and southern Italy, the political situation remained chaotic. Naples, under King Ladislas, briefly emerged as a powerful force, but after his death in 1414, the region fell back into civil war. The Papal States continued to be a battleground for Condottieri, and it was in this environment that two of the greatest Condottieri of the period, Braccio da Montone and Musio Attendolo Sforza, emerged. Their styles of warfare would influence Italian military history for the rest of the century. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Italy was a patchwork of city-states and territories, each vying for power and influence. Among the most prominent figures in this landscape were the Condottieri mercenary leaders who commanded armies for the highest bidder. Two of the most notable Condottieri were Musio Attendolo, better known as Sforza, and Braccio da Montone. Their careers and rivalries shaped the military and political landscape of Italy. Sforza was born in 1369 into the influential and warlike family of the Attendoli in Romagna. Although not noble, the family was affluent and had a strong presence in Cotignola, a town that would later become a key part of Sforza's life. At the age of 13, Sforza became a page to one of the men at arms of Boldrino del Panicale. This early exposure to military life set the stage for his future. By the early 1390s, Sforza was serving under Alberigo da Barbiano, first as a squadron commander, and then with his own contract for 75 cavalry. His reputation grew, and by 1398, he was an independent condottiere, defending Perugia against the Visconti. In 1402, he joined the Florentine army and was captured at Casalchio. However, he remained with the Florentines and became one of their leading commanders in the campaign against Pisa. By the time Pisa fell in 1406, Sforza had 180 lances and was well on his way to becoming one of Italy's leading military figures. Sforza's success was not just due to his military prowess, but also to his strategic alliances and marriages. He was described as handsome, with fierce features and a powerful physique. He was intelligent, crafty, and a skilled orator, able to inspire his troops with compelling speeches. His troops were known for their discipline, which allowed him to control them on the battlefield more effectively than most commanders. He believed in cautious tactics and placed a strong emphasis on infantry, which was unusual for his time. In 1409, Sforza defeated Ottabuono Terzo, a rival condottiere, and was rewarded with the castle of Montecchio in Emilia by Niccolo d'Este, the Lord of Ferrara. Sforza then joined the army of the Papal Angevin-Florentine alliance against Ladislas of Naples. His military genius was evident in the great victory at Roccasca in 1411, after which he was made Count of Cotignola by Pope John XXIII. However, he later switched sides and joined Ladislas, receiving a contract for 830 lances. Despite his military success, Sforza struggled in politics. He was twice imprisoned in Naples, but was released due to the loyalty of his family and troops. His main rival, Braccio da Montone, was a formidable opponent, known for his fiery and brilliant tactics. Sforza's political role was often that of a military commander for one of the political factions in Naples, and he never seemed interested in establishing his own independent state. In 1424, Sforza marched north to settle scores with Braccio, who was besieging Aquila. The harsh winter forced Sforza to use the coast road, and at Pescara, he faced the swollen river Pescara held by the Bracceschi. Despite the challenges, Sforza led his advance guard across the river, but found that the main army had halted. He returned to lead the rest of his troops across, and set out to ford the river for the third time. Tragically, one of his pages got into trouble, and as Sforza turned to help, his horse lost its footing. Sforza, fully armored, fell into the river and drowned. His son, Francesco, took over the Sforza companies and continued the family's legacy. Braccio da Montone, born in 1368, was from the noble Fortebraccio family of Perugia. He was known for his courage and audacity, but had a slower start in his military career. He was captured in his first military engagement due to his impetuosity, and later suffered a severe head wound that left him partially paralyzed and with a limp. Despite these setbacks, he was a commanding figure, described as tall and always standing out in a group. In the early 1390s, the Fortebraccio family fell out of favor in Perugia and went into exile, losing their estates. This made it difficult for Braccio to establish himself as a commander. He He served under Alberigo da Barbiano and with Florence, but it wasn't until 1406 that his career took a significant turn. After successful operations with Alberigo, he set out on his own, determined to make his way. He began to build his own company, relying on his fellow exiles from Perugia. In 1407, Braccio was offered the lordship of Roccacontrada in the Marches in exchange for protection. This gave him a secure base, and he steadily built his strength. He moved from one side to the other in the power struggles between Ladislas and the Papal Angevin alliance, always with Perugia in mind. In 1414, Pope John XXIII made Braccio Captain General of the Church and Count of Montone, setting the stage for a rivalry with Sforza. The decisive moment for Braccio came in 1416. He launched his final assault on Perugia, and the Perugians appealed to Carlo Malatesta for help. The Battle of S. Egidio was a turning point. Braccio's tactics involved dividing his army into small squadrons and committing them to battle in rotation. This allowed his troops to fight fiercely in short bursts and remain fresh. During the battle, Braccio's foresight in providing water for his troops gave them an advantage as the long day of fighting wore on. Braccio's forces broke through, and Carlo Malatesta was captured. This victory made Braccio the master of Perugia and the surrounding towns. Braccio governed Perugia and continued to campaign each year, either in self-defense against the Pope or in the Neapolitan Wars against Sforza. He built extensively in Perugia and reorganized the Perugian militia. His company became increasingly made up of Umbrians and began to resemble a national army. In 1424, Braccio faced a much larger combined army of Papal and Neapolitan forces outside Aquila. Despite his initial success, he underestimated his opponents, particularly Giacopo Caldora, who had learned from Braccio. Caldora's army was divided into large squadrons, and he used the Braccesco method of rotating his troops. Braccio's smaller army was eventually overwhelmed, and he was captured. He died 3 days later from his wounds and despair. The battles of Egidio and Aquila not only shaped the careers of Sforza and Braccio, but also influenced the next generation of military leaders. Many of the commanders who fought at Aquila, such as Niccolo Piccinino, Gaetamlata, and Bartolomeo Colleoni, would go on to become prominent figures in Italian military history. The names of Sforza and Braccio remained battle cries for decades, and their legacies lived on through their families and the commanders who followed in their footsteps. By 1424, the political landscape of Italy was changing. Milan, Florence, and Venice were embarking on prolonged warfare, leading to the development of more permanent military institutions. The papacy was also rebuilding its authority, and Alfonso of Aragon was beginning his campaign to claim the throne of Naples. The era of the independent Condottieri was waning, and a new phase of Italian military history was beginning. The Battle of Aquila left a void in the leadership of two powerful armies. Sforza and Braccio, the great commanders, were gone, and their armies were left in disarray. Braccio's eldest son, Otto, was too young and inexperienced to lead, so the real power fell to Niccolo Piccinino, Braccio's favorite lieutenant. But Piccinino's growing influence made other leaders jealous, and they started to break away to find their own opportunities. In the Sforza camp, Francesco, the son of the fallen leader, took up the mantle. He was already familiar with command, and managed to keep a large part of the army together. However, some of his cousins, like Michele Attendolo, decided to go their own way. Michele, known as Micheletto because of his small size, was a seasoned soldier who had served under Braccio before joining the Sforza family. After the Battle of Aquila, he joined the Pope's army. By 1430, Micheletto had a company of 200 lances and 50 infantry. He realized that to grow his reputation and his army, he needed to join a larger and more active force. He tried to negotiate with Venice, but they already had strong leaders like Carmignola and Gianfrancesco Gonzaga. Milan wasn't an option either, as the Duke had both Piccinino and Francesco Sforza in his service. So Micheletto turned to Florence, which was struggling in its war against Milan and trying to capture Lucca. In April 1431, Everardo de' Medici, a representative of Florence, met with Micheletto's staff in the village of Medicina. Florence underestimated Micheletto, thinking he would be happy with a small increase in his company. but Micheletto had grander plans. He demanded a contract for 600 lances and 400 infantry, an advance of 65 florins per lance, an immediate bonus of 6,000 florins, an extra florin per lance each month, and a guarantee of employment even in peacetime. He knew how Florence treated its condottieri, and he wanted to avoid being dismissed as soon as the war was over. When the Florentine War Council heard these demands, they were in a tough spot. Their current captain, Niccolò Fortebraccio, was threatening to resign unless he was compensated for his losses. Florence needed a victory, and the campaigning season was starting. Averardo was instructed to make 3 offers: 600 lances and 300 infantry with the same pay as Fortebraccio, 660 lances and 300 infantry, or 600 lances, 300 infantry, and the position of captain general. They also promised Micheletto a personal pension of 10,000 florins a year for 5 years after his service. Fortebraccio left when his demands weren't met, and Florence had no choice but to agree to Micheletto's terms. The contract was signed in May for 630 lances and 400 infantry, and Micheletto was made captain general. The extra florin per lance was kept secret to avoid setting a precedent. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, a leading politician in Florence, personally delivered the command to Micheletto in Arezzo. Micheletto insisted on a formal ceremony in Florence, timed by astrologers for good luck. On June 13, 1431, he rode into Florence with his men, took the oath, and officially became the Florence army's new leader. This story shows the complex relationship between soldiers and their employers in Renaissance Italy. The negotiations were not just about money, but also about prestige and authority. The number of troops, rates of pay, advances, and future standing were all part of the bargaining. Micheletto's demands highlight the changing attitudes of the time. Soldiers were becoming more aware of their value and sought better terms. The condotta, the contract between the condottiere and the employer, was a crucial part of this system. It specified the number of troops, the duration of service, and the pay. Early condotti were often for short periods, usually 2 or 3 months, and ended when the campaigning season was over. But by the early 15th century, contracts were typically for 6 months or longer. The introduction of an option period, known as the ad beneplicitum, allowed the employer to extend the contract for another 6 months or more. This led to more continuous service and the development of permanent relationships between condottieri and their employers. Pay was a significant part of the condotta. The advance, or prestanza, was a payment given to the condottiere to help re-equip his company and move it to new service. It usually represented a quarter or a third of the total pay for the initial contract period. If the contract was for more than a year, the advance might be half the first year's pay. The prestanza was paid off by reducing the monthly pay until the advance was covered. The condotta system also applied to the internal structure of the condottier's company. Subordinate commanders and lesser soldiers received their own condot from the condottiere. For example, Micheletto's company had 561 lances when he joined the Venetian service in 1441, including 167 condottieri. Some of these men had up to 50 men at arms, while others had only 1. By the mid-15th century, condotti were becoming more standardized and formalized. The duration of contracts increased, and the option period became a common feature. This allowed for more continuous service and the development of long-term relationships between condottieri and their employers. While some soldiers preferred the security of fixed-term contracts, the trend was towards more permanent service, especially in states like Venice. Florence, however, was slower to adopt these changes. Even in the 1470s, Florence had few permanent condottieri, which caused problems for the city's military efforts. Micheletto's experiences in the early 1430s show the challenges and the evolving nature of the condotta system in Renaissance Italy. The world of condottieri, or mercenary commanders, in Renaissance Italy was complex and often filled with intricate agreements and unwritten rules. These warriors for hire played a crucial role in the military and political landscape of the time, and their contracts, known as condotti, were the backbone of their service. At first, most condottieri were hired for short periods and rarely served the same master twice. However, by the 15th century, a significant change occurred. Many condottieri began to serve states more permanently, leading to more formalized and sometimes abbreviated contracts. Despite this, the basic structure of the condotta remained, detailing the terms of service, pay, and obligations. One of the most important types of contract was the condotta in espero. This allowed a condottiere and his company to be on stand, by, ready to serve when needed. During this time, they received reduced pay, usually about 1/3 to 1/2 of the full rate. This was especially useful for condottieri who had their own independent bases or principalities, as it gave them the freedom to manage their own affairs while remaining available for service. Another significant development was the condotta, that specified different company strengths and pay rates for wartime and peacetime. This became common in the Venetian army in the 1440s and spread to other Italian armies later in the century. During peacetime, condottieri often returned to their principalities and maintained smaller forces, which they could quickly expand when needed. The division of booty and prisoners was a standard part of the condotta. Generally, the condottiere and his troops kept movable goods they captured, while the employer claimed buildings and fortifications. High-ranking prisoners and those of the employer's own state had to be handed over to the employer, usually for a ransom. Other prisoners became the property of the condottiere and his men. However, mercenary troops did not primarily rely on booty and ransoms for their living. Their main source of income was the regulated pay stipulated in their contracts. The contracts also included various clauses to ensure the condottiere's authority over his men, exemptions from taxes and tolls, immunity from debt collection, and provisions for food and lodging. The condottiere and his men swore loyalty to the employer, and inspections were conducted to ensure the company's strength and readiness. These inspections were often detailed in the early contracts, but became less formal as the system evolved. At the end of a contract, the condottiere had the right to seek a new employer, and was guaranteed safe passage beyond the former employer's borders. Additionally, the condottiere and his men promised not to fight against their former employer for 6 months after the contract ended. While the condotta provide valuable insights into the relationships between mercenaries and their employers, they are not the whole story. Governments closely monitored their condottieri through civilian commissaries, who acted as direct supervisors and liaisons. These commissaries could sometimes cause friction, but they also played a crucial role in coordinating the army's activities and ensuring the condottieri followed orders. Rewards were an essential part of the system, used to maintain loyalty and encourage long-term service. These rewards ranged from increases in pay and promotions to gifts like silver helmets and cash bonuses. Pensions were also common, both during service and after retirement, and sometimes extended to the condottiere's family. Estates and fiefs were often granted as rewards, tying the condottiere to the state and providing them with an independent base. In the end, the condotte and the relationships they governed were a testament to the complex and evolving nature of military service in Renaissance Italy. They reflected the shifting balance of power and the growing need for more permanent and reliable military forces. Despite the formal agreements, the real strength of the system often lay in the personal bonds and mutual interests that developed between condottieri and their employers. These relationships, more than any contract, shaped the military landscape of the time.